Welcome to the museum. Apologize a bit for the late start. We usually call it Jewish time. Tonight we'll call it Jewish Unitarian time. You had the pleasure to listen to a quartet that played music from this wonderful film, Defying the Nazis, the Sharps War. And I'd just like to share with you that you heard two songs, Childhood Years, composed by Mordecai Gebertig, who was killed in the Warsaw Ghetto, and another song, Here, O My Child, the Wind is Blowing, that also originated in a ghetto during the war. We have many special guests with us tonight. This is a very exciting evening for us at the institution, long awaited. Always in this institution, our most special guests are Holocaust survivors. Many have joined us. We have our friend Ken Burns, our longstanding friend Artemis of many, many years, and the Joukowsky family. And then we have, again, very honored to welcome some of the individuals whose lives were shaped by the Sharps. And I just want to acknowledge this night would not be possible without our partners and co-presenters, WETA, PBS, Florentine Films, and the Better Angels Society. I'm Sara Bloomfield, the museum's director, and I just wanted to share with you a few thoughts that I think about that are important to frame the story of what these two remarkable individuals did. And it reminds me of something our late chairman, Elie Wiesel, said about the museum. He said, "It's not an answer, it's a question." And I would say it's many questions. And that's our goal, is to provoke those questions. Questions like, why did the Holocaust happen? One of the big questions is why there was so much indifference. And another way to think about that is to ask the question, what made those rescuers so different from everyone else? When you think about the state of the world in 1938 and 39, you really have to wonder what exactly motivated the Sharps. How is it that they saw the world so differently? The museum is preparing a major exhibition right now on Americans in the Holocaust that will ask many penetrating questions like these, and ask us to think about ourselves as individuals and as a nation. Our exhibition will tell this story. When FDR assumed the presidency in 1933, just 2 months after Hitler came to power, he gave his famous speech about fear, at that point trying desperately to restore faith in a severely threatened American economy. But in truth, America had many fears that would play out over the momentous years ahead. Fear of communists, fear of blacks, fear of Jews, fear of foreigners. FDR had his own fears about Nazism, but our country was not quite with him because they too had a fear of war. In every election campaign until Pearl Harbor, FDR had to re-promise the country that we would not go to war. All along, the awful truth about the escalating persecution of Jews and others had been widely reported in the American media, with the Nazis garnering many cover stories in magazines like Time and Newsweek. And yet, even so, in the fall of 1938, with the eruption of nationwide pogroms across Germany, the world was stunned. In an era when newspapers were still truly important, it was headline news everywhere. The LA Examiner's banner read, "Nazis warn, Jews will be wiped out unless evacuated by the democracies." Right after that, public opinion polls in America showed that 94% of our country disapproved of the treatment of the Jews in Germany. But 72% said we should not allow any more Jews or refugees in. A few months later, in February 1939, the Sharps would set sail for Europe. That same month, legislation to permit an additional 20,000 children above our very rigid immigration quota was introduced in Congress. After all, who could fear a child? A child would not become a communist. A child would not take away someone's job. And yet the bill died in committee. In May '39, as the Sharps were barely hanging on in now German-occupied Prague, the U.S. turned back 900 desperate refugees on the ship St. Louis, an act also bolstered by American public opinion. A Gallup poll that month indicated that 29% of Americans felt there was likely to be widespread action against Jews in the United States. And 20% of Americans were sympathetic with such action. So to say that the Sharps went against the grain does not begin to describe the level of physical and moral courage they displayed. But they had something else. They had moral imagination. They could imagine the human capacity for evil, and they could imagine the possibilities for action. Like all of us, they too were surely human and surely had their own fears. But they also understood, perhaps in a way beyond those that FDR intended in his speech, the true power of fear itself. The power of fear to paralyze us, to help us rationalize our behavior, and to weaken our moral compass. The Holocaust often challenges people to ask, what would I have done? Martha and Waitstill Sharp challenge all of us to ask, what will I do? In an institution that is many questions, that is probably the ultimate question. So for tonight's event, after a few speeches, we are going to show you 30 minutes of clips from the film, and then we are going to have a live stream conversation with our filmmakers. There will be a few minutes in between for setup, so we ask for your patience and ask that you use that time to fill out your questions and give them to the ushers that will be picking them up. And please, we want you to share your reflections on the hashtag SharpsWarPBS. Also, when we start back with the reception, with the interview and the panel, I will be re-welcoming you again. It's a little bit awkward, but we have an audience that will be joining us from all over the country, and we hope from around the world. So before we begin, it's now my great pleasure then to introduce a partner for this evening, Sharon Rockefeller, President and CEO of an organization that has given me many, many hours of wonderful education and pleasure, WETA. So Sharon, please join us on the stage.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to join you tonight. And thank you so much, Sara, for hosting this screening and for the support of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum as a local underwriter of Defying the Nazis, the Sharps War. I'm pleased to be joined tonight by representatives from PBS, including Chief Operating Officer Jonathan Barzilay, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and members of the WETA Board of Trustees. We are very grateful always to our WETA members and to those who provide specific underwriting for our productions. Funding for Defying the Nazis, the Sharps War, is provided by the Better Angels Society, including Jan and Rick Cohen, and Jonathan and Jeannie Levine, the Star Foundation, the Threshold Foundation, the Seastone Foundation, and from donations from other individuals. Local broadcast of the program is supported by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, thank you, the Morning Star Foundation, the Isidore and Bertha Godelski Family Foundation, and by the Jacob and Charlotte Lehrman Foundation. WETA is your local public television and public radio station. We are also the second largest producer of content for public television stations and for PBS nationwide. We produce the PBS NewsHour. We create documentary series with Dr. Henry Louis Gates, better known as Skip Gates. We create performance programs such as the Capitol Fourth from the lawn of the U.S. Capitol, In Performance at the White House, the Library of Congress Gershwin Prize for Popular Song, and the Kennedy Center Mark Twain Prize for American Humor. In all, we produce about 450 hours of original content each year to share with our local area and with the nation. At the core, at the very center of WETA's production partners for over 30 years has been Ken Burns. It's a love affair. Ken is America's storyteller, bringing us sweeping films on the Civil War, baseball, jazz, America's Best Idea, the national parks, along with other intimate profiles, such as recent films on the Roosevelts and Jackie Robinson. We have the next 20 years chartered out. Ken's films and their extensive digital resources have had tremendous impact on our country and on our culture. They serve as core materials in countless classrooms and have shaped national conversations, yes, about our past, but also about our future. What you may not know about Ken is that he is one of the most generous and most collaborative artists of our time. He works with film schools, educational institutions, historical sites, scientists, technology innovators, all in the service of inspiring others to follow their passions for exploring the extraordinary stories that define our national character. Through Ken, we met his wonderful co-director of this film, Artemis Joukowsky. Defying the Nazis represents on many levels the power of just such a shared journey. Please join me now in welcoming my dear friend, Ken Burns.
That was a good one.
Wow, that was an extraordinarily generous introduction, and as Sharon knows, who's introduced me many times, that I always feel compelled to inoculate myself. I live in a tiny little town in New Hampshire that probably in its center village has fewer people than in this room, and I've lived there for 37 years, and I have on my refrigerator an old and faded cartoon that shows two men standing in hell, the flames licking up around them, and one guy says to the other, "Apparently my over 200 screen credits didn't mean a damn thing." They don't, of course. What means something are the kind of themes that I hope we've been able to engage in this film. I do, like Sharon, need to thank a lot of people, particularly WETA, who's been my production partner for 34 years. It's been a wonderful, wonderful partnership in the greatest network on earth, PBS, who's here and supports our films, and we always get support from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And Sharon mentioned the Better Angels Society, which is a nonprofit that was started by individuals interested in helping us complete our productions, and they've been extraordinarily generous over the last several years, and particularly in the case of this film with Jan and Rick Cohen and Jonathan and Jeannie Levine. And I wanted to just particularly thank them for their generosity and loyalty and support for this particular project. This is, yes. We're going to have a conversation about the way this film echoes in the present day, and that's hugely important. But you have to know, as a filmmaker, you're interested in only one thing, or three things: a good story, a good story, a good story. I had been friends with Artemis for many, many years, and he had been talking about this project for a long time, and he got it started, and he'd often ask for advice that I could give him sort of easily. I had my own sort of full plate of several films being juggled at once, and 3 years ago he sent me a rough cut. Emphasis on rough, but it was a diamond in the rough. And for the last 3 years, I have had the distinct pleasure of working on this film. I admitted to a reporter a few weeks ago, and have done so daily since then, I think that I have looked at this film, screened this film, in process more than any other film I've worked on. And a lot of it had to do, it was that it was an orphan. It wasn't a film I'd incubated from the beginning. It wasn't a film in which I had anything to do with the shooting or the original collection of archives, but something I came to at the ultimately critical process in documentary filmmaking, or at least of this kind of editing. And over the course of those 3 years, I made structural changes, big and small, and editing and pacing changes, big and small, and was able to get the voice of Tom Hanks to read the voice of Waitstill Sharp. But I think one of the best decisions I ever made was to leave alone the voice of Martha, read by Marina Goldman, who's an extraordinary actor, who's here tonight. I worked with an amazing team of filmmakers who were struggling to make it, editors and co-producers, and no one sort of more central to this production than Matthew Justice, who's here tonight and deserves the credit. Artemis's original design was that I would be the co-director of this film, and I just sort of laughed at him, and I said, not going to happen. And so I figured I'd be an informal advisor as a friend, and then all of a sudden I found myself as an advisor, sort of formal title, then a kind of senior creative consultant, then an executive producer, then, due to Matthew's extraordinary generosity, the co-producer with him, and then all of a sudden the co-director of this film. And I'm not sure exactly how that happened, but I'm here first to tell you that this is fully Artemis's film. This is his lifelong project from age 14 to this moment. It will not end tonight. It will not end when PBS broadcasts this, WETA, here in Washington, D.C., your public television station, on September 20th. We learned today at the White House that the president's going to be holding a conversation about refugees on the 20th, and we just want to make sure they end by 9 o'clock so that they can get their fill of an inspiring story, and it's not just all the opacity of policy. But it is Artemis's film, and I have been just somebody who's been a helper along the way, and it's been an extraordinary journey for those of us who've been involved in it. It is so important, and to me it brings up three very simple things. One is about sacrifice. These sort of questions about that Sara was suggesting, and thank you, Sara, for hosting this extraordinary event, of what we would do when the question comes back to us, that the arrow never in our media culture comes back to us. It's always about the other. And the Sharps really force us into the uncomfortable position of asking ourselves some pretty tough questions of ourselves, and I like that. And it's also sacrifice not without cost. The second thing is potentiality, that I always felt that it was very difficult to understand the full magnitude of what this extraordinary museum tries to understand. It is not an answer, but a continuing question, and that is, of course, what we know is what life is about. But it is also about those lives lost and how we can feel them and sense their potentiality. So here is a tiny story, relatively tiny story, on the very edges of the Holocaust, sort of knocking politely at this mammoth thing. But in its small example, William Blake, the English poet, said you could find the world in a grain of sand. In this grain of sand, you have the notion of what lives could have been. The people who were saved represent an extraordinary set of accomplishments, and it makes you fall back on the people that we dedicate at the end of this film, those who could not be saved, what we're missing from them, how poor we are in the absence of those lives. And I hope for the third point that there is some resonance, that it speaks to us of today's questions and problems and ideas, not just because we're experiencing a refugee crisis second only to that of the Second World War, but because we're faced with the echoes of our past. And we're faced with the possibility of evil. We're faced with a great deal of things that threaten the fragile fabric of our republic. And this film, for some reason or another, seems to raise them, or I hope raises them. It is every filmmaker's nightmare to not show you the entire film. Relax, it's only an hour and a half. I usually kid you, and you know, if it's the Vietnam film, which is coming next, we'd be out at about 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon with no food or bathroom breaks. But we're only going to show a handful of clips, the introduction, an extended introduction from the film, and then 3 other things. As Sara suggested, they end up in Prague getting refugees out, and we thought we'd sample a little bit of the kind of work that Martha was doing and the kind of work that Waitstill was doing, sort of separate from one another, though they work together quite often. But this is an extraordinary story. A middle-class couple, a Unitarian Universalist minister and their wife, whose only drama is what he's going to say on Sunday, from one phone call to a few weeks later find themselves in the middle of Prague getting refugees out, behaving like spies. You could not make this up for a James Bond film or an Alan First novel. And I was stunned by the transformation in their lives. And then after this first trip, they assume they're going back to that comfortable life and are sent back against their will for a second trip, and they sort of find their work. And so we sample in our final clip what's happening in the summer of 1940 in the south of France, first with what Waitstill is up to and then what Martha is up to again. And then I very much look forward to our conversation together. But let me again thank the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for existing. I came here in the first nanosecond of its opening many, many years ago and was completely transformed, as I'm sure all of you who have been here have been, for their support of Artemis over the years and for their support of us in this production and in coming productions, we hope. And thank you also for your attention and generosity tonight. I hope you enjoy the clips.
I'm Sara Bloomfield, the museum's director, and this evening is made possible through our partners, WETA, PBS, Florentine Films, and the Better Angels Society. You know, it's extraordinary. Martha and Waitstill Sharp from Massachusetts, who are active in their Unitarian church, made this really remarkable decision to leave their children and to go into Europe right on the cusp of World War II. It was clear Europe was about to break out into war, and this was at a time when most Americans were worried about keeping us out of the war and keeping immigrants out of us. That was the focus in this country, and they made this radically different decision. They went right into the heart of darkness. They lived in German-occupied Prague, Vichy France, and out of that led these many clandestine missions to bring hundreds to safety. And it's wonderful that tonight we have some of those children with us. I'd like to acknowledge and ask that they please stand. Joseph Strasser, Alex Strasser, Amelie Diamond, Holmstrom, Peter Brownfeld, Catherine Chavney, and Ronald Levy, whose mother was rescued by the Sharps. It's a great honor to welcome you to the museum tonight. We're also honored that we have many members of the Sharp family. I know my friend Artemis, I call the Joukowsky, the Sharp Joukowsky family. Would you please stand so we can acknowledge you? Woo! Martha and Waitstill's family. So, and I hope all of you will be joining this conversation and taking advantage of Facebook and Twitter and using the hashtag SharpsWarPBS. So I'm delighted to welcome two great friends of this institution, Artemis Joukowsky, the grandson of the Sharps, has been a longtime friend of ours for many years, and sitting next to him, a man who needs no introduction, Ken Burns, also a friend of this institution. I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then we hope that you have some questions and will join us. But Artemis, I want to start with you, and I just want to ask the question that I was thinking about watching this for the second time. When did your grandparents die, and did they die in a world where they were widely recognized? Did they come back and talk a lot about this? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, my grandmother remarried a wonderful Jewish man named David Kogan, and in the world that she lived in, which was the New York Jewish community, and she was a fundraiser, she was a kind of fundraiser who would look at you and say, "Oh, Sarah, those are very nice pearls. That could save a life." And you're undressing in front of her as you speak. Yeah, so save a life. So she was one of those people, and in that community, people did recognize her, but she never asked for recognition. And I think at the end of her life felt peaceful with what she had done because of the people in her life making it special. My grandfather, on the other hand, never spoke about this. And really his first public interview was only a year before he died in 1981. And it was the first time he had spoken about it, partly because I think he lost so many people that they fought for. There were so many lives that they lost that he was embarrassed about taking credit for this. He also felt that there was a code to not disclose what he had done. And so he didn't. And I think lived many years of his life not wanting acknowledgement, but being sad that they couldn't do more.
So tell us about, how old were you when you first discovered this remarkable family story, and how did you discover it?
Well, I didn't know anything about these incredible people. I had grown up overseas in different countries, and my grandparents were not part of our lives. And when we moved to America, I was enrolled in a school, and in the 9th grade, it's actually an amazing story in my own sense of what can 9th graders do, I was given an assignment to interview someone of moral courage. And I came home and I asked my mom, who should I interview? And she said, talk to your grandmother. She did some cool things during World War II.
Wow.
And little did I know that she had not just saved the lives she saved, but had taken a stand as a woman to leave her family, to go help these people. And I think always felt a sense that her life could never quite be understood in the modern context of who she was. And I think this opened up a chapter in my relationship with her that changed my life forever. At that same time, I had just been diagnosed with a neuromuscular disease, and she was the kind of person who came into the hospital room and said, "You're not going to feel sorry for yourself, let's go. Let's go help other people." And we went to the Boys and Girls Clubs, we went to Hadassah meetings, and she really mentored me to not focus on my own challenges, but to love others.
Wow. So that set you off on this like almost lifelong journey.
Right.
That eventually brought you to us.
Exactly.
So
in 1999, I discovered, after my grandmother died, in the basement of her home, about 14 boxes. With Larry Benequist, who's here, we went down into the basement and found these original documents of rescue. Names of people, like Peter Braunfeld's name, and we went about searching, how do we find these stories? And one of the most amazing things was talking to people that they had rescued and finding out they knew nothing about the Sharps either. So part of this was reconstructing the history of what had happened, one person at a time.
So this is an issue that's hinted at a little bit in this, but you know, when we think about these people like the Sharps and this extraordinary heroism, sometimes I think we tend to glamorize them a little bit, and yet the film reveals that they're very human and that they all had personal issues in addition to this extraordinary thing they did in the middle of war. But this decision would have a lot of impact on your family. There were a lot of personal consequences here. Are you comfortable saying a little bit about that?
I think for many people during this period, they lost people in their lives. It was not uncommon for people to feel regretful and sad about this war. I mean, we romanticize wars like this one in particular because we won, and we have a sense of pride in that winning and what we sacrificed, as Ken said, for that war. But also, they lost a lot of people, and I think they felt in their own lives a sense of not just regret, but what more can we do? What more can we do? I think our family life was clearly frayed. I think by the time they came back the second trip, they had no money. They had used all their money to help people. They were largely almost bankrupt. And I think that put attention on the family life. My grandmother went into another direction of being a political person. My grandfather went more into refugee, so they fell apart as a couple. And that, I think, happens to many, many people, but clearly this experience changed them forever, and their marriage ended as a result of that experience. And that's one of the reasons I didn't know about this story, was that each person had remarried other people, and the other person they were married to didn't necessarily want to talk about what they had done with someone else. So this became this discovery of my own family.
Oh. You know, Varian Fry, who we saw him, he worked with the Sharps. He had a similar experience. He came back after the war and could never find a normal life again, ended up getting divorced, being very isolated. Here you see his picture, and died shortly after the war. And at his funeral, one of the people he rescued spoke and said, after the war, he was like a racehorse hitched to stones. And, you know, I think World War II was so enormous, so consequential. A lot of people were never able to really recover. So, Ken, I'm going to switch up now from the Sharps, as you said, a grain of sand, to the big picture about history. And I want to ask you, you gave a recent commencement speech at Stanford, and there were some lines in that speech that we wish we at the Holocaust Museum could have written, because that spoke directly to our mission. And you wrote, the past often offers an illuminating and clear-headed perspective from which to observe and reconcile the passions of the present. The practice of history becomes a kind of conscience for us. And then you said to the students, it's tough out there, but so beautiful too, and history, memory, can prepare you. So in an era when the humanities are under threat and STEM is the big rage, talk about why history is so important.
Wow. I think we prefer to say that, you're condemned to repeat what you don't remember, that history repeats itself. Mark Twain is supposed to have said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. If he did say that, I've been in the business all of my life of trying to listen to those rhymes. I think that human nature never changes. And so the study of history permits us a kind of armor and a kind of perspective that permits us to have a little bit better relationship with this present and to also ensure that we have a future. You look less for the repetitions than you do for the patterns and the themes. And this can be an incredibly powerful tool to have. I'll give you an example. When the meltdown happened in 2008, I had friends even in the business community who said, this is a depression. But I had learned that in the Depression in the United States, in many American cities, the animals in the zoo were shot and the meat distributed to the poor. And that if that would happen, I would agree that this was a depression. But in fact, it looked like a very serious recession. And so historical perspectives give you a little bit of guidance. And I think what happens is that we have become so focused on a present that is dominated by a technology which is the tail that's wagging the dog and not the other way around, that we have convinced ourselves that only STEM works, and even the sort of ability to turn that into STEAM, adding the arts to that, misses the point. We have lost in our schools the teaching of history. It's called social studies, but we've lost the history of teaching, and we've also lost the teaching of civics. Civics isn't just that there are 100 senators down the street and there are 435 representatives and it works this way and there are 3 branches. Civics is how you get things done, how you get along, and I think we've lost a hugely valuable part of human interaction as we become more and more just about what we do at our thumbs and fingertips. And I think I was trying to tell the students at Stanford in June that these were great technologies, but we had to dominate them. Otherwise, we would be dominated by them. And as I think this film points out, we become susceptible to those people who know how to manipulate media to their own advantage and can emphasize things that are about fear and not about things. I mean, you described in America in the 1930s that was fearful of immigrants, fearful of getting involved in another war, fearful of all of these different things. And we see today how easy it is for the simplicity of that fear narrative to operate when in fact a wholly other and much more dynamic and complicated truth with a great deal of undertow actually obtains. But we don't have sort of the language now, as we've dumbed it down. We're using fewer and fewer words to actually parse the extraordinary differences. So we don't have elections, we have attacks. We don't have issues, we just have, statements. And so it makes it very, very hard for our polity, and particularly those distracted by this all-consuming media present, to focus on something. History is always going to be that extra help, regardless of how we get it.
Always. I always say to the staff, they're sick of hearing it, but one of the things the Holocaust teaches us is that technological progress is not moral progress. Right. The Nazis were so quick at using the internet of their time, something we call radio. They understood propaganda in the most extraordinary ways, and they exploited it. And frankly, the people around them the moderates didn't quite get the value of mass communications and those messages. So, but I want to probe this a little bit further about history, because I think it's a question, like museums are wondering, do we need to step into this void here? We just did an informal online survey with a relatively very small sample, but it indicated that 40% of history teachers were not sure who was president during World War II. Right. So that's the right reaction. Now what do we do about it? So I have a question, and actually this is for you, Ken, but Artemis, you have your own family history. Our nation is facing a big problem, because when we're talking about, and even I read an article in the Times about the election, and it actually lamented the fact that so many young people today really didn't know much about our history, American history. They mentioned the Holocaust specifically, and that young people didn't have a framework for seeing the election. Mm-hmm. So I would welcome any thoughts.
Well, this is what we've described. I mean, we're in the middle of a kind of perfect storm of ignorance, and that the ability for those who are good at manipulating the media to convince you that it's raining when it's actually sunny outside, or to continue insist that it's sunny when it's clearly you're soaking wet. And that is a great trick, and it's not dissimilar to what we saw in Nazi Germany and what happened. I mean, I was aware that the Nazis, the National Socialist Party in Germany, actually looked at the Jim Crow exclusionary laws of the American South to model their early exclusionary laws against the Jews, and more terrifyingly, they looked to states like Virginia and others that practice eugenics to begin their own experiments. And so while we hold ourselves up, quite rightly, as a beacon, we also have to be aware that Wynton Marsalis said something to me in the jazz film, sometimes a thing and that opposite of the thing is also true. And so that while we see ourselves as a beacon of freedom, that we've had this unusual history, protected as we have been by two mighty oceans, we are also nonetheless susceptible to certain toxicities within us that we have to be on guard. And one of the greatest things is this historical amnesia that permits us to forget what's happening. A lot of it has to do with our relative youngness. We think that we can progress by burning our past behind us like rocket fuel. That only gets you a short distance. But we have now entered an age where I believe the combination of a media culture, this focus on an all-consuming moment, that is to say, if you just smell the right way, wear the right blue jeans, drive the right cars, everything will be okay. But it will not be okay. And when the inevitable vicissitudes of life visit us, what resources will we have to fall back on? And there are many of us, I believe, in this room who know that having a historical awareness, even a basic one, is critical to your survival when those inevitable vicissitudes beset us.
Yeah. I have two things that I'd like to share. One is, as you all know, that Nazi Germany at that time was one of the highly educated countries of the world. So it's not just about education, it's really about a moral education. So it's about looking at history in the context. And one of the things that Ken talks a lot about is the narcissism of our age. And if you're a narcissistic person looking at history, you're not going to see patterns of destruction. You're going to see yourself, or you're going to see what you want to see out of that. And I think one of the things that's been remarkable about working with the museum and working with Ken is that these stories are told through individual lives, people's lives, and then from them we can understand the bigger context of history. So what I would love to see from this film is a moral education, not just an education of intellect or information, but what is at our heart and how do we make the right choices?
And I also think when you look back at the history, like as you mentioned, Germany it was not necessarily a problem of education that Germany had. In fact, Germany had, I think, more Nobel Prizes than any other country.
And you consider it the height of sophistication,
right,
of artistic development. Right. I mean, if you were going to be in the most cosmopolitan place in the world in the late 20s and 1930, you would have to say Berlin.
Yeah. But was it an education that taught critical thinking, independent thinking? I think that's one of the key questions. It's one of the things the museum thinks about a lot, is we try to bring Holocaust education and stimulate young people to think critically. Okay, I have a few specific questions. This one is from one of our guests here in the audience. For either of you, how many were saved totally? And among those saved, how many were Jewish and how many were from other groups?
So, of the direct rescues that the Sharps made, we count 130 people, about half were Jewish. The rest were children who didn't have, any necessarily affiliation, but were desperate or were needing to get out. And then there also were social democrats who were rescued, people who would have been killed if the Nazis had taken control. So 130 is the number they directly rescued. But there is a family here, the Levy family. Why don't you raise your hands? So the Levy family I met about 6 months ago in New York, where they came to me and said, I found papers that show that your grandparents helped our family get to Genoa, and then from Genoa to Shanghai, and thank you very much. And we had never met them before. And so this relationship is one of these beautiful examples that most of the papers, most of the documents, most of the information the Sharps had on people, when they rescued them, they burned them. So they had no evidence of who they rescued. So like the Levys, we didn't know about their story. And so that's one of the beautiful things about this film, is that we get a chance to understand that for these lives, this is what we know, but there are many more lives that we don't know about yet.
And another important thing is, as you mentioned it, as the film does about Very and Fry, is they are then themselves connected to all these different organizations, and all those different organizations have their own activities that they're pursuing and rescues that are taking place and overlap. And I think it's to Waitstill's credit at the end of his life that he's ashamed that he hasn't saved more. I mean, this is how Schindler's List ends, a very, problematic individual who rescues people, but for him it's never enough. And when we know the dimensions of the Holocaust, nothing is enough. Nothing's enough.
Yeah.
That's sometimes where you don't want it to be too daunting. Sometimes we at the museum want to make sure that that's why we humanize, because every life, one life, is enough.
Right.
Obviously, in the catastrophe of this size, everyone will feel inadequate in what they do, but if more people did more,
Well, this is the essence. When I was talking about the 6 million being a kind of unapproachable figure, you here at this museum, what so impressed me, and we borrowed it for our film on the Second World War, which is you change 6 million to a different kind of calculus. You say, in 1933, there were 9 million Jews in Europe. By 1945, 2 out of 3 were dead. And that makes you think. It's like Lincoln saying 77 years ago. Nobody talked like that. He wanted you to say 87 years is in and of itself unremarkable, but I want you to do the math to understand how young we are. Mm-hmm. And so you do the math. And that's a different thing than just holding out a figure that now is you were even suggested, forgotten in schools. That for those of us who haven't forgotten it, it is still impossible to enter. And what you permit here, by personalizing it, by making an individual journey for each visitor here, plus that reworking of the original calculus, is an invaluable tool in helping us sort of energize our own thinking about it.
Yeah, and actually, and you go up in that exhibition, you don't really see 6 million.
No.
And that's really one of the few places we even talk about numbers. We then want to go right on into those individual stories on all sides of the equation. So this is a question. The Sharps' work spanned Europe. How did you find materials for the film beyond their diaries?
Well, that
You came to the Holocaust Museum, right?
Well, the museum was the first phone call we made. And the museum was not just our willing partner, but our excited collaborator. They not only helped us archive our papers, but connected our papers to the Quaker papers, to the Red Cross papers, to the Czech papers, to the French papers. And we worked together in a team of about 10 researchers. And now I'm happy to say that the museum has digitized over 200,000 documents. This museum on American basic rescue of people during World War II. No one had ever done that. No one had ever known of the American role. And the reason I'm so excited about your next initiative about America and the Holocaust is I believe we're going to find many more Martha and Waitstill Sharps. We're going to find more stories like this of Americans, like the man we mentioned, Leon Ball. Whatever happened to Leon Ball? He was an ambulance driver from Butte, Montana, got pissed off about Hitler, went to Europe, started helping people over the Pyrenees. He disappears. What a story. So the Sharps, think of the Sharps as the pinnacle of an iceberg. And within it are all these people who help the Sharps. For every Sharp person, there are thousands of people who support them. And one of the really exciting parts of this project has been to connect all those original organizations and their papers with our papers to combine them into a larger understanding of this history.
I just want to take this moment to make a plug for collections. These stories we can't tell these stories, whether they're Ken Burns stories, museum stories, none of them can be told without the authentic materials, the documents, the photographs, the artifacts, the film footage. Please, if you know of anybody who has them, if you have them, we're the museum, donate them to us, we'll let Ken use them.
Sarah, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that drew me to this, as Artemis and Matthew brought me the early footage, was just the authentication that had taken place. Certainly there's generic footage that is familiar to us, which is sort of the glue that holds some of the stuff together, but the real internal glue are all the records of the people. So you have Mercedes Brown, you have people holding up the documents, you see the passports, you see the young photos of these people, you connect with the earlier picture. Peter looks exactly like his young, you didn't see it this evening, but it's an amazing transformation, and I love the time travel that takes place there.
See Peter and his lederhosen.
Yeah. If you couldn't hear that, Peter and his lederhosen in the film. This is a very interesting question. Were records kept of the children so that they could be reunited with families after the war if they survived?
Well, what's amazing about the Sharps and the Unitarians and the Quakers is that almost every parent that was left behind was reunited with their families before the war. So if you look at Peter's family, or if you look at Catherine's family, they were able to get, or Joe Strasser and Alex Strasser's family, their father was able to come through some process. So for those 27 children, they had some semblance of a family again, which I'm very, grateful for, that work never ended. I think in terms of the records, we will never know exactly how many people they helped. We found about 400 names that we think they helped in some ways, and the Levies are part of now the 401 name. But at these events, people come up quite frequently and say, by the way, I want you to know that we discovered the Sharps' name in our documents and we want to know more about it. So this is part of this process where the film is done, but the research and the storytelling goes on.
So speaking of really all of you helping us do this research, because
Exactly.
There's certainly more to be uncovered, and I hope if anybody's listening tonight, if your life was touched by the Sharps, let us know. We have actually a research effort right now, a citizen history project called History Unfolded, where we've asked people all across the country to go to their local library and research how the Holocaust was reported in your local papers at the time. And, you know, people think we didn't know. Of course, everything was being reported. Maybe not always headline front page news, but it was all there. And it's really in every community in this country, big cities and small towns. So go on our website and help us with that. I have a question. This is from somebody on social media. And there's kind of two related. It's for you, Ken. Was there one moment in the Sharp story where you said, you just realized, I've got to do this film? And then kind of a related question is, what do you look for in creating your films? You must be inundated with great ideas.
If I were given 1,000 years to live, I would not run out of stories just in American history to tell. And the answer to that is, to the second part, is just good story. A good story. You know, we never make films about stuff we know about. We make films about things we don't know about and use the research as the process of discovery. But this is a film delivered, you know, halfway done. And I was drawn to so many moments in it. There's a wonderful moment when he's off in Paris and she's in Prague and they're writing these extraordinary love letters. And she says, I've just read Lady Chatterley's Lover, and I want to discuss this with you. If any of the congregation knew about it, they'd disown us, you know. And there's a kind of like, whoa, Martha, woo, right on. You know? And I love that. The letter that begins the film is also at the end of the film in much longer, and it was only at the end of the film, and I wanted to bring it up, that yearning, so that this is a story that isn't just this larger story of the Holocaust, but it's also about two extraordinary people who are, you know, in love with each other, and that sacrifice, as I mentioned earlier, has its cost. And that letter is just filled with such direct and poignant yearning. There's a moment that you've seen, two moments that you've seen tonight that really struck me in the raw, or as we worked on it over the years, spoke to me about the central themes. And that's one where Whitaker is talking about it's hard to conceive of the idea that somehow to protect you think you can protect your children by holding them tight, and sometimes you have to let them go. I'm the father of 4 daughters. I get it in an intellectual way, but it is just so heartbreaking to think about the kind of Sophie's choices that were made to save your children, to put them in strangers' hands, to do that. And then I love that conversation that Feuchtwanger has with Waitstill when they get on the boat. He's saved him, and he says, may I address you as a character in a novel? And there's a great way to talk to somebody who's just saved your life. And the idea that Waitstill, you know, if this was been a Hollywood movie from the time, Jimmy Stewart would have to play him, you know. He just say, no, you know, I just don't like little guys to be shoved around. And he says, this is really bad, but I have a sense something worse is going to happen. Yeah. And this is the prefiguration of the Holocaust. And he gets it. He understands something. From earlier today, Artemis was talking about his declaring war from the pulpit in Wellesley, Massachusetts, on Nazi Germany, which was a kind of, you said arrogance, which was exactly right. It was a chutzpah that permitted him to declare war on Nazi Germany from the pulpit. Those are all the things I like, and trying to figure out how to put the story together has been the great jigsaw puzzle of the last 3 years. So
just to back to the bigger picture about picking films, topics you...
It's just that has a good story. You're looking for something that fires on all cylinders. And sometimes, you know, you've got something that seems obviously great, but what's so good is the resonance. You know, there's... it's not just the world in a grain of sand, as Blake said. It's also this notion that in some religious teachings they talk about as above, so below. So that the workings of the solar system resembles that of the atom. And that you can find in the layers of the Sharp story a whole bunch of stuff. When you think about it, if 6 million fills this room, then the Sharps did this. But if you get into them, they actually illuminate a good deal of the rest of the place.
Well, they're having influence now.
Yes.
And thanks to you, they're going to have influence in this institution, we hope, forever.
Well, this is the existential question at the heart of it that I think we've talked about. You spoke about it this evening so eloquently. It's like, what are you going to do? We clearly, it isn't just sacrifice. We talked about that. Potentiality, I talked about that. And this notion of resonance, meaning we are in the middle of a refugee crisis second only to the Second World War. What would you do? And I love even what you saw, and it repeats throughout the film. It's a theme where the Sharps are essentially saying anybody would do this. And of course, almost no one would do this. And that's an interesting thing. How is it that we permit ourselves to be so passive? We think we do a good job by coming here and listening and visiting and supporting and all of that. But what will we do when faced with that, We were asked at an earlier event today whether by a college student, what should I do? And you just want to say, see if you can get a Syrian refugee into your dorm room. Yeah. That would be okay. I mean, if the Lebanese can take in over 1 million refugees in a country of 4.5 million, and we can't even bring in 100,000, right. Out of 340 million.
You mentioned earlier about history and human nature, and I would say that I think those of us that work at the museum believe this is essentially a museum about human nature. And one of the sad lessons is it's about how we can pretty much rationalize any decision we make in life.
Anything. And we can imagine the worst.
Yeah.
And make that worst happen.
So, Artemis, what made your grandmother decide to run for Congress? When did that happen?
So she had obviously come back and spent quite a number of years from 41 all the way through 45 advocating for the American first to get into the war. And I think no one was more happy when FDR declared war on Germany than Martha and Waitstill Sharp. Because they knew that what they were doing was too little.
Let me just be the historian and correct you. FDR declared war. Actually, the Congress, who, if you read the Constitution, declares war, he asked for a declaration of war on Japan. Within a couple days, Germany did him the greatest favor that has ever been done to the United States. They declared war on the United States, which is what Franklin Roosevelt, wanted more than anything else.
This is how we've worked together, so you can. So now that I've been clarified that piece of it.
Sorry.
No. This is the mentor relationship. But for what I think compelled her was to make a bigger impact. I think she was a woman with a vision to help many, many people. Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, was an example to her of a feminist woman leader that could make things happen. And she was enrolled by the Democratic Party to run against Joe Martin, who was a Republican. He was, after this election...
Was this in Boston?
Speaker of the House, yes. It was the 8th District in Massachusetts. And another clarification? 14th District. That's my mother up there. It's you or it's Ken, what can I say? Or Matthew, for that matter. So the 14th District, you can see the strengths and weaknesses already, right? But anyway, the point is, she, as a woman, felt, I think, a voice was missing, particularly for, there was a big part of her district that were working class from New Bedford and that part of Boston. And she was red-baited. I think what happened in the election was the anger of the kind of J. Edgar Hoover period, calling her a communist, Father Coughlin, others in that spirit, and she lost the election. But it changed her life, I think, to see that she could play a bigger role. She was asked to go into the Truman administration and worked in the Truman administration. And then when my grandparents divorced, became a fundraiser for Hadassah and Jewish causes, and left really her whole life, at the end of her life, was raising money for Jewish causes that she cared about.
That's remarkable. So I want to close on getting back to the world today for a little bit. Recently, at the State Department, several people issued a letter of protest about State Department policy, I think, on Syria, and they went through something called the dissent channel. And all I kept thinking about, gosh, what if there had been a dissent channel in the 30s? The world would be different. But we didn't have a dissent channel, we had the sharps. So do either of you, this is a question from the audience, they're really asking about what the State Department did or did not do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's an extraordinarily complicated story, which we're very interested in doing a film on the larger issue of the United States and the Holocaust. And there's a great deal of evidence and situational events that point to a hugely, overwhelmingly anti-Semitic State Department that was more than happy to draw the line at the quotas that had been sent by a isolationist Congress about the number of people who could come in, so that the St. Louis, filled with Jewish refugees, was turned away from Santiago, Cuba. They felt they had already taken in too many Jews, and was turned away in Florida because the quotas were filled up, and many people in Roosevelt's inner circle were frustrated, as was he, by that. But I think it's a story that we need to tell. Many, many, many other questions we have to ask of ourselves, that we've sort of only begun to touch the subject. I think it would be worthy of a film investigation for sure.
Artemis, do you?
I don't think there's any question. Breckinridge Long, for example, was clearly instructing consul generals around the country, around the world, not to admit Jews in, to make it hard for them to apply for visas. I think there were members of the administration, like Eleanor. She wasn't officially a member, but she played a very activist role, who were not anti-Semitic. I think anti-Semitism was a relative, and it was on different spectrums. There are people like Cordell Hull that were very supportive of the Sharps and didn't exhibit a lot of what we'd call anti-Semitism, but there were others that were. And I think it shows that there was a lot of confusion in America.
25% of American Jews oppose the admission of any Jews, more Jews, to the United States. Yeah. So it's a super complicated conversation that has a lot to do, we were talking about assimilation. When you come, it's every immigrant group has received the treatment, and once you're a couple generations away, somehow the memory of that treatment leaves, and you become part of the mainstream that wants to keep the next group out.
We should also mention that the State Department was responsible for closing down the Varian Fries operation and the whole Hiram Bingham in the south of France. That was a consular office of the State Department. Yeah. And they knew what they were doing. They were helping Jews and others to get out, and our government closed them down. It wasn't Vichy France or the Germans, it's our government.
And in the case of Martha, she, in 1940, went to the internment camps of the Japanese and said, why are we interning Japanese? Why do we assume these are disloyal Americans? Imagine if we'd interned all the Germans. Eisenhower would have been in a camp, not leading our country toward victory. So there's a certain kind of historical ignorance about race, generally race itself, where we all come from, and the fact that we don't identify with our fundamental connection as humans. We look at superficial ideas of what it means to be human. And I think one of the most honoring parts for me of working with this incredible man is that we have been allowed to tell these very intimate stories and make it part of history. And one of the coachings that Ken did was tell those individual stories, but remind everyone that it is 1933 and Hitler has just been elected. Tell this intimate story of the Braunfels or others, but explain what it took for them to get out. So to look at history in this way, where you dive into the individual story, but you always understand the context.
So we have the September 20th. The film will be premiering on PBS stations nationwide. Defying the Nazis, The Sharps War, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Please watch it. Please help us collect. Please help us do this research. And in April 2018, please come back and see our exhibit on America and the Holocaust. And share everything that you learned tonight, we hope, on Sharps War PBS. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our guests.
Thank you.